Um, I have just, I think, two things that I want to say before I introduce our speakers. One is that this has been a journey for me, putting this discussion together. There are so many wonderful stories. So I'm hoping that it's not the last, and that you as an audience will have other opportunities over this next year to hear stories, not only from the African American community, but from other communities, and I know you will, but particularly in the African American community. This African American community here is unique in many ways in that it is very old. There were, of course, there were enslaved Africans here, but at the end of the Civil War, there were people who bought property here, and you have a community that really started here as an established community in 1865. It's a very old community. And of course, when you have an old community, you have lots of stories, lots of stories. The other thing that I wanted to say is that in the process of talking these lovely people into taking this risk and coming to talk today, I did find some people with great stories who weren't able to come. And I'm going to read you just one of those, just a very short excerpt. This is Ruth Burton's story, Ruth Wood Burton, and I did an interview and it's copied in the back. But since this is also 1 year from the centennial, I think it is, of Columbia Pike, that you would be interested because she grew up on Columbia Pike. And this is what she says about Queen City and Columbia Pike. She was born, her name is Ruth Wood Burton. She was born in Arlington, Virginia at 1011 Columbia Pike on 9/8/1918. That was her grandmother's house, and she was born in the house. The backyard was large and flat. Columbia Pike was dirt, and there were no sidewalks. Sidewalks were put in when they paved the road. There were houses on both sides of us and across the street. We were near South 9th Street. My godmother lived next door. The Safeway that's now on Columbia Pike was a grocery store named the Sanitary. There were 2 stores run by Jewish folks where we could shop. I remember big pickles from a barrel with a peppermint stick that we stuck into the pickle. And that, Mr. Hyman sold those. Mr. Siegel was the other store. He sold crackers. Both sold canned goods. My grandma had a lunchroom up the pike. She sold sandwiches, pickled tripe and sliced tripe. I think I remember the tripe because that's what I liked. She probably made other things too. Holmes Bakery had a delivery truck and made a good pound cake. The first bus I rode was called the Arnold Bus Line. There was a line from Queen City to Roslyn. On the trolley and the bus, the driver always said to us, "Step to the rear." The streetcar ran on a track parallel to Columbia Pike, some distance away. And I invite you to read the other material from her story because it's a very interesting story. Now, the people whom we have with us today, and I've told them so many times, thanks for their coming. And I'll say it again, thank you for all of your efforts in coming. I'm going to introduce, tell you a sentence or two about each of them, and then they're basically going to speak in the order that they're sitting here. Maddie Walker is an old friend, actually. Maddie Walker is a colleague. She was one of my instructors in how to be the president of the Arlington Education Association, because Maddie she was a teacher in the system and then a counselor. And she's going to tell you a little bit about how that came to be, but she was also then the president of the Arlington Education Association and the first African-American president of the Arlington Education Association, and always a great help to me. Kenny James was born in D.C., but he was raised in Arlington, right? And he is currently the regional food service manager for the D.C. Public Schools, and he will tell you he has family connections as we speak to the Arlington Public Schools because he has children in them. And Patty Monroe Meek was raised in Arlington, although, as she told me, her actual birthplace was Cheverly. That's where the doctor was. She is the youngest child of Eleanor Ames Monroe, and she's going to talk a little bit about her mom and her dad. And so Maddie's going to start.
Good evening. If Ichabod Crane had fallen asleep when I was a child growing up, and he awakened tonight, he would be so disoriented. He wouldn't recognize anything. Arlington was no longer a farming community when I was growing up, but it evolved. It was a bedroom community, literally a bedroom community, nothing there but houses. Then, of course, it became suburbia, and now to avoid that word city, you call yourself an urban village, whatever that is. But my time began when my father migrated to Arlington from Mecklenburg County, Virginia, where he lived. He was a married teenager living on his family's farm. And it was the practice at that time for people to come by, and the young men would take jobs away from home to gain, to make a little bit of money. His family raised tobacco and cotton, so he had never done it before, because he had not come of age, but now he was. So one day some recruiters came by and asked for someone to come to Arlington and to take a construction job. The job was to build a school for the colored children. And it turned out to be on land that was donated by an African-American family that you were just mentioning about, the Hoffmans and the Bostons. They gave their land to build a 6-room school, Hoffman Boston. So my father came, and he had wonderful stories to tell about 3 other guys came, and they all lived in one room and ate bologna sandwiches because they didn't know how to cook. But anyway, he worked to build that school. And he was hired as what the Labor Department calls a common laborer. He was a farmer. He was not a skilled laborer. He worked with the dirt. But as the job went on, he heard about the Washington school system that had a dual system. They had school in the day and in the night. And he and my mother had not had the opportunity to go much further than the 8th grade because there were no facilities, no schools for them in Mecklenburg County. So when someone came by from the Helms Concrete and Pipe Company and offered him to come to work with him, he thought, yeah, we'll see. And so he brought my mother and his grandmother, whose house he had moved into in Mecklenburg because he had a bride and he needed more space. And they came to Arlington. She came to Arlington, and my father, after digging all day, enrolled in Armstrong Technical School, and my mother, Mary Washington Domestic School. Mary Washington, it doesn't exist anymore.
Armstrong does.
Oh, yes, Armstrong does. Mary Washington is defunct. So they got themselves through high school. Time passed, and he went to work for the Helms Concrete Pipe Company. He didn't know he'd be there 40 years, but he did. And he was making more money. So eventually he arranged for his portion of the farm to be taken over by tenant farmers and so forth. And then the children began to come. We fast forward a little bit, and when I was 4 years old, I was one of 4 children. When I was 4 years old, one September day, my birthday is in September, my mother took me, put on a dress instead of the play clothes that I wore to St. John Baptist Church Nursery School. She put on her hat and gloves and put a book in her purse, and we went up to Hoffman Boston School. And she told the principal she wanted to enroll me in 1st grade. Well, neither the principal nor my mother knew anything about readiness or socialization, that sort of thing, and I was enrolled in Hoffman Boston School. They regretted it, but I settled down eventually. Then fast forward some more. I have graduated from college, and I'm in Arlington interviewing with Mr. Charlie Wilson, the person in the personnel department for a job. So in the course of the interview, Mr. Wilson said, "Aren't you a little young to be teaching?" And I thought to myself, if your mother had put you in school as a toddler, you'd be young too. But I didn't say that. What I said was, I wasn't too young to certify. And the minute I said it, I wondered if that was flipped. But he did hire me. He called me back in, and he gave me a 10-month contract at the magnificent sum of $2,900 a year. And it was to be paid over a 12-month period of time, and I was assigned to teach at Hoffman Boston School. Well, I was euphoric. I was rich. But when school opened and I went into class, I reflected. I thought, the first public school that I ever attended and the first school in which I taught was a school that my father built. And I thought that was very cool. And I still think it is.
It is very cool. It's all right.
My father, I went to Hoffman Boston School through the elementary grades until I was in the 5th grade. And they wanted me to go to Dunbar High School because Dunbar High School was an academic school and had a wonderful reputation. So when I was in the 5th grade, we moved to, I went to Stevens School in Georgetown because that was sort of the feeder school to go into Dunbar. And if I'd like to give you a picture of what Arlington was like you were identified by your families. And they were families, had migrated here. My father was one of the younger ones as far as residency was concerned, because people were there in Arlington who had been here back to the time of Freedman's Village.
Yep.
And it was a very stable community, and it was a very cohesive community. It was very cohesive, and the people were very close-knit. And at that time, people took care of each other's children. Later on, someone wrote a book, I think it was our Secretary of State, It Takes a Village. Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly the way it was. And I use the word cocooned. We were cocooned because Arlington was a very segregated place. And segregation is ugly. I don't care where it takes place. It was a very rigid. But the thing that saved us was that there was nothing here to segregate. Arlington was a backwater.
Yeah.
There was nothing here. There were no restaurants. There were no movies. And we lived right next door to Washington. We didn't even call it Washington. We said in town. And we would ride our bicycles down and go to the museums and so forth and just do all kinds of things. And then, too, a part of it was the style of child rearing. Our parents took great care to keep us insulated from things. They didn't talk about things when children were around, and they steered you. I can remember if my mother was going to have company in the parlor, the kids left. They just didn't tell us and talk about things. Now, some of the families that I remember that looked after us were the Burtons, the Jameses, that's your family. And I like to tell a little joke about Roberta Flack. There was a Mrs. Burke, was a family of Burkes, and it was a ritual that when you got to be a certain size, you went to Mrs. Burke for piano lessons. So you got washed up, and you had to be very quiet on the porch and waiting your turn. And Roberta Flack is a Burke. She gained fame by Raindrops Keep Falling on Your Head and Burt Bacharach. And I can't play a note, but I love to tell people that I had the same teacher as Roberta Flack. We had a lot of fun doing things, and we were just not aware. I think we were younger in maturation and development than our chronological years, because we endured some things that we didn't even really know. For instance, one of the best things that I liked was going with my father to the Industrial Bank on U Street. Oh, it was so fun. We'd go, and afterwards we'd have lunch and had an ice cream cone, and I'd look in the, we would visit the Skurlock photographers, very famous black photographers who had a window to their studio on U Street. Well, I did not know, it was a long time before I knew, that the reason my father was going to the industrial bank was no black person to have any banking privileges.
Here.
And I didn't know that. But we just didn't know certain things, and that kind of cocooned us. Also, we used to go to an amusement park, which was down where the National Airport and Gravelly Point, in that area. And we had lots of fun there. And I didn't know until I saw in the paper that some children, some girls from Howard University were protesting the discrimination at Glen Echo. Mm-hmm. And that's how I knew that while we had suburban park, that we were confined to going there. This is a beautiful library. But the library was one of the things that you had here. You had a library that were two campers to hook together, and you dare not go there. And I usually tell people that I'm a native Arlingtonian. I am not. I correct myself when I think about it, and because I was not born in Arlington. And one of the reasons that I was not born in Arlington is because Arlington Hospital did not allow black people to be served there. So my mother, the only people my age, and I'm older than they are, the only people my age who were born in Arlington may have been born at home, or they were born on the Virginia side of 14th Street, trying to make it to Freedman's Hospital. But my Dr. Bruner and Dr. Johnson were doctors here, and they took care. Dr. Bruner took care of my mother, and then she went to Mecklenburg. Now Mecklenburg was segregated too, but there were 3 doctors there who had a clinic from Meharry. Meharry is the institution that has trained more black doctors than any other in there. And he had residents from Meharry, and they had a clinic set up, and she was safely delivered there. And then she would come back when she would travel. And so I was conceived in Arlington. And I did that. When I was completed the 5th grade, my parents built their own home, which is on First Road, around the corner from Dr. Drew.
Ah, yes.
And so forth. That's where we lived there. And there's one of the things I think is one of the most insulting things that I could possibly think about is the business about riding the bus, the back of the bus. However, I never rode in the back of a bus. And that's a story in itself. One time we were having dinner at my mother's house. This was back in the days when you had family dinners. And somebody mentioned something about Rosa Parks. I don't know if it was her birthday or what, and my mother pointed across the table and said, "That's our Rosa Parks." And she told a story about how when I was 3 going on 4, I went with a lady on the bus to go into Washington. During those days, women used to go and spend the day with each other, and you brought your child. This lady didn't have a child. She borrowed me. She wished she hadn't. And so when you came back from Washington, in Roslyn, the streetcar stopped there. So when you got out of the streetcar on this side, you were in Virginia. Now, many years, I think in 1919, I don't go back that far, but the buses and the streetcars in Washington were integrated. You could
Yes.
sit anywhere. But when you got to Roslyn and you turned, this is where you did that. Well, she got on the bus with me and sat in an appropriate for her place. But then as the bus filled out, there was a waiting period. She was told to move. Well, I don't know whether I was looking at dust balls on the window. Who knows what a toddler does? But I wouldn't
Wouldn't
let her
move.
get up. And she had to get off that bus, walk all the way up to Hatfield. It's called Penrose now, but the stop was Hatfield. And when she got home, she was just about to collapse. And so, knowing my father, he decided I wouldn't always be 3 years old, and he wasn't going to take a chance on having us ride. So we didn't ride the bus. And although I went to high school in Dunbar, and I went to elementary school through the 6th grade in Stevens, we never rode the bus.
He drove you.
He drove us. My father was a kind of a mechanical genius. The first car he bought, he took it apart to see how it worked, and taught himself to drive it. And I married a man who was a graduate engineer from Rutgers, and he said that my father knew things instinctively that he had to look up in the books. So my father always had cars, more than one around. He loved cars. I had to get rid of some cars when he died, but that was his hobby. But he always made sure there was a car for my mother to drive us back to school. I think my time is up.
It is.
All right.
Thank you so much. Kenny?
Wow, that was a wonderful story, wonderful story. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kenny James, and I'm very happy and delighted to be here today to share my experience of growing up in Arlington. First of all, there's so much that I could tell you, but because we have time constraints, I've tried to limit my words to the following. The first one is talking about my family, which is going to take up the majority. My school experience here in Arlington, sports and recreational experience, which is a big part of my life in Arlington, and then community pride. First, I'm going to start off to tell you a little bit about my grandparents. My grandparents were Eugene and Mamie James, and they came to Arlington from Culpeper, Virginia, around the early 1900s. Like many other blacks, they were looking for a better way of life, and so they migrated north. It was said that my grandfather and his two brothers left Virginia, left the country, heading north. My great uncle George didn't stop until he got to New York City in that area. My great uncle Edward settled in Rhode Island, so he continued to go north. My grandfather got to Philadelphia, and he pumped his brakes and stopped and didn't go any further. It was said that he forgot something back down Culpeper. That turned out to be my grandmother, so it was a good thing that he went back for her. So they came back up, and they relocated in Arlington, Virginia. And this is how the James family settled and came to Arlington, Virginia. I also want to point out that my grandfather worked at the White House for many years. He organized a black butler and waiter union and was one of the first black maitre d's at the White House. So that was some unique things about my grandfather growing up that I always heard stories about. Now, my grandparents raised 6 kids in Arlington, and I'll tell you briefly about them. My aunt Elizabeth Hazel, who many of you might know if you're educators here in Arlington, she was a teacher, administrator, and you could almost write a book about her. And she worked in D.C. public schools in Arlington County public schools for years. Next was my uncle Eugene. He owned his own transportation company, which was his own cab service, and this was pretty big for a black man growing up at the time. My uncle George was an educator and administrator in Fairfax public schools and Alexandria public schools. He also helped to run a store in the basement of our old house called James Delicatessens, a.k.a. George's Store. I also want to add that I always heard stories about Roberta Flack, who would visit to the store to buy candy before going to Drew School. Next, we have my my aunt Mary Morgan, and she was an educator in D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. And my youngest uncle, who's here with me today, Uncle Mark, who was educator in D.C., retired from D.C. public schools, and also continues to teach here in Virginia. I also want to say, Uncle Mark, that I had the privilege, I went to Kramer Middle School, which I always heard about growing up, and as I was walking through the halls, I was telling my supervisor, I was like, wow, I'm going to speak today, and I'm going to mention my uncle, and this is the actual school that he taught in. So I was there visiting the cafeteria and the lunchroom, so I thought that was pretty unique. Also, one thing about my family, and Uncle Mark, I'm going to pick on you a little bit more. It's a good thing. My Uncle Mark because he was the youngest and closest to a lot of the kids growing up, he kind of helped, kind of played with us and took us around and taught us a lot of different things. I never forget, and don't get him in trouble, but my uncle taught us how to shift gears in a Volkswagen. So he would drive, but my brother or my sister and I, we would take turns shifting the gears as my uncle. Now you shift into first, all right, pull it back to second. Now you got to hear the engine. Now you hear the engine, listen. But those were things that, as a young kid, we learned how to do. And, it wasn't much traffic and so on. But that was something unique that I had growing up in Arlington. The third oldest.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the third oldest was my dad, Cleveland C. James Sr., a.k.a. the good doctor, the head chief, the chairman, and everyone's big daddy. You see, growing up in Arlington, I had to share my father with the community because he was such a big part in the community. Now, he retired from 2 jobs, the Pentagon, where he worked for years in the printing department, and also worked many years with Arlington County Public Schools in food service. Now, one of the things he did in food service, he helped many of the immigrants that came here to Arlington in the late 70s and the 80s. The Vietnamese boat people that came here, he helped them learn a skill so they could go on and get jobs. And I would remember how many of the people were grateful that he was able to pass those skills along to them. But my dad was also chairman of St. John's Baptist Church Deacon Board for 37 years, and he was known a lot for that. He was a deacon for 45 years, and in 2002 he was named Chairman Emeritus, or forever the chairman. So that was one of the things we had to grow up sharing my dad. Now, as much as my dad was a great man, I got to talk a little bit about my mom, because if it wasn't for my mother, my dad could never have done all these things that he did. My mom's name was Mary Louise Goods James, and she was kind of the rock of the family. So she kind of held things together. She dished out the discipline and, threatened us that, if we did get in trouble, she was going to tell our father. And meanwhile, she took care of business while in his absence. My mom was raised by her grandparents in Foggy Bottom, which was a part of Washington, D.C., and then also Arlington. Now, the reason why she was raised by her grandparents was because in 1929, when she was born, her mother died, and it was of a simple ear infection. But you see, in 1929, penicillin had not been invented yet. And I always remember her telling me stories, and as when my kids would get sick, about penicillin and, and the antibiotic that we have now. So when we get infections, it's something we don't even think about. But yet, she didn't even have her mom because she passed away from a simple ear infection. My mom also, when she lived here in Arlington, she grew up on the land which is now Mount Zion Baptist Church. So she would always point those things out to us as well. The last elder that I want to talk about is my Aunt Pauline. And she was we talk about families being close and friends and everyone kind of knowing each other. Well, my Aunt Pauline Hansborough White Yancey, She was she's my aunt and also my godmother and my brother's godmother, and was my mom's best friend through elementary school and junior high school and high school. She was my dad's cousin, and she lived not too far away, or actually across the street from where my dad grew up. So she was responsible for putting my parents together, and hey, she wanted, told Mary, I've got a cousin that, I think you and him should get together, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And that was kind of a lot of times that was common for those things to happen. So we were very thankful for Aunt Pauline, because without her, there'd be a lot of less Jameses in Arlington. Now, my parents were married for 54 years, and I have a picture of them that I was able to bring up, and they had 5 kids. My sister Nita, she's an educator. She is now the first Black City Council woman in the city of Roanoke, Virginia, which is down south, down 81. My brother Cleveland Jr., we call him Bubby. He is a administrator, principal at Langston, and he's been here in Arlington for many years. I have a sister named Pam. She went to school here at Wakefield High School, and she's now a healthcare management administrator in Florida. A brother, Eugene, Jimmy, Miss Knight taught my brother Jimmy and myself and Patty. He is a real estate, I'll say, expert down in Atlanta, Georgia, and we keep telling them that we need him to come back to the D.C. area to help stabilize our real estate. All right, I got to fly through this. Okay, so as you can see, and then last but not least is myself, Kenny James. I'm the youngest, and I'm in food service. I took education and my family's love of food and combined them, and I'm able to work in that field. As you can see, family was very important to me growing up, and it was kind of the center of my life. And because of segregation, we all lived close together and didn't realize that. As Ms. Walker kind of said, you didn't realize, oh, my grandmama lived right up the street on 17th, my aunt lives on 18th, my uncle lives around the corner in Falls Church and in Alexandria, so on. We didn't realize that, but that was because of segregation. But to me, it was a great thing because I loved having my family, all my cousins. My brother was my best friend. My cousins were my second best friends. We had all that, and we were very tight-knit family. I'm going to tell you real quick about schools, and one unique thing about schools growing up here. I attended Drew Elementary School for kindergarten and first grade. This is around 68 to 1970. And my mom worked there, my aunt worked there, many of my neighbors, people from my church worked at Drew School. Well, around 1971, they integrated the school system for elementary school kids. So now my brother and I, we went to Tuckahoe Elementary School, which is way up on the north side. It was about a 45-minute bus ride for us to get there. After about 2 weeks of going to Tuckahoe, my parents set us down and said, Kenny, Jimmy, do you want to go back to Drew? And we were like, for what? And not to say that we loved Drew. It was in our neighborhood. We walked to school and so on. But we were like, Mom, Dad, they have a brand new gym, media center, playground, log city. The fields are immaculate. We don't mind riding the bus for 45 minutes. I later learned, though, in life as a grown adult, and when I was in college studying about the Supreme Court decision that in separate but equal, that it was not equal. And I was living proof. I lived through that. I just didn't know that at the time. I'll take you back about 10 years ago, when I was still living here in Arlington, maybe about 15 years ago, 15 years ago, I would fight with the Arlington County School Board to get Drew Elementary School to get it remodeled or rebuilt. And one of my points I would always make was about Tuckahoe and how nice the school was back in 71, 72 when I went there. 25 years after that, Tuckahoe was being renovated again, and Drew hadn't been touched. And now my kids were going to school there, and we were like, no, we can't have that. So we had to always fight and stand up for what we believed in, and that was something I learned from growing up in Arlington and with my family and so on. But later on, I went to Williamsburg and Yorktown, and I just want to say, by going to school there, I think that helped expose me to, by going to school in North Arlington, that exposed me to other parts of Northern Virginia, Falls Church, McLean, Fairfax, Reston, Vienna, Great Falls. I was able to, I met friends that lived there and so on, and that was one of the great things I loved about Arlington was the diversity and being able, being exposed to different things. Sports and recreation. When I grew up in Arlington, we didn't have video games, cell phones, Facebook, Twitter, computers, and so on. The house was for sleeping, doing homework, talking to your family, and my favorite, eating. We as kids, we lived outdoors, and what Arlington was great for that. We rode our bikes all through the neighborhood. We had bike trails that could take you all the way up to Herndon, the C&O bike trail, and down to Alexandria and down to Mount Vernon, and we weren't afraid to get on our bikes, get some water, fill up some canteens. We didn't have water bottles and bottled water. We'd fill up the canteens or a milk jug or something, and we were gone, and all day we would take these trips. Also, playing sports all over the place at Walter Reed, Carver Center, Drew, any place we could find. Bluemont Park, Lacey Woods, Thomas Jefferson. These were great things that we did playing sports. Also, we had 3 high schools, all with swimming pools. And those swimming pools were open year-round. And that's something, as I live outside of Arlington, and I lived in California and all over the place, Arlington is unique because back in the 70s, we had these pools, which were very great. Well, my time is up. I didn't get to finish it up, but
A last sentence.
in closing, I just want to say that growing up in Arlington, it instilled a lot of pride, a lot of tradition, a lot of family members that were here, and I'm thankful for it. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you, Kenny. Thank you.
One thing I want to mention before I start, Kenny and I are neighbors. And the one thing he might not know is his brother used to have the best parties in the world, and he was older, and I was never allowed to go. So I would sit, because Bubby would always tell everybody, hey, I'm having a party. All the neighbors knew the music would be loud, and I would be in my room dancing by myself, and I'd be, please, Mom, can I go? No, you're too young. So I just had to put that out there. I don't know if you ever knew that. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm Patty Monroe Meek, and my father was Thomas Randolph Monroe, and my mother was Eleanor Ames Monroe. And they grew up in Cape Charles, Virginia. It's on the eastern shore of Virginia. And at one point, they were next-door neighbors. Not everyone knows that. However, oh, I'm sorry, you can't hear. I thought I had a big mouth, too. I used to have a name called the Fillmore Lip here. Oh, no, it's not carrying. At one point, my mother and father were next-door neighbors. However, my father was 9 years her senior. So as she blossomed into a woman, their relationship changed. He fell in love with her, and in 1955, they married, and they came to Arlington County. They lived on a little street called Lowell Street. It's now considered Knock community, and all of us were born during that time. So they were there for probably 6 or 7 years. I remember my mom telling this one story. It was so roach infested that one day when she was sleeping, a roach crawled into her ear. From that point on, all of us had cotton balls in our ears when we went to sleep. So my brother Charles, and I call him Mickey, Charles was 5 years older than me. My brother Tommy was 4 years older than me, and I was the baby, and probably the most rambunctious. So when we finally moved to Fillmore Street, that's another area in Knock community. It's on, let's see, Our Lady Queen of Peace and Army Navy Country Club. It's on that side of Glebe Road. That community was really owned. At one point, the land was owned by Annie Belcher, a black woman, and Lillian Thompson. They owned a lot of that land, and they sold it to a lot of black people, and it became our little community. It was a wonderful community. It was one of those places, if I were doing something wrong, guess what? They knew. The neighbors would know. I would get reprimanded by then, and of course, the call would go home to my parents, and I would be reprimanded there. The neighborhood was mostly boys, actually, mostly 4, 5-year-old. They were 4 to 5 years older than I was, so I grew up as a tomboy. Loved it. If I played football with them, I had to be tackled. If I cried, you can't play with us. We don't want you playing. If you can't handle it, get out of the kitchen, so to speak. So I grew up that way. I was very, very outgoing at home, but in some ways I was very, very, separated from the rest of the community because I was the youngest. And my brothers were more, homebodies. So I didn't get to go into the heart of Green Valley as much as I would have liked. So I was very, very, outgoing there, but most of my friends were there in the community. I didn't really have any female friends that I talked to. It was more like a male relationship. We'll play football, we'll play all these active things, and it was great, but I was very imaginative. So a lot of times I would go and I would make believe I was maybe on stage somewhere, and I would be singing a song, and I would be playing all kinds of imaginary games and writing. However, when I was at Drew, it was a very different experience for me. I was very, very quiet at Drew. I never felt like I fit in. I never felt like there was a commonality. The teachers, however, it was wonderful because they came from the community. So they were vested in each and every one of us. They were, as Kenny said, either in your church, your neighborhood, friends of your parents, that sort of thing. So that was wonderful. When I was at Drew, I made straight A's, but very, very quiet. And then there came, I forgot one other little thing. And one day I was a brownie, literally one day. My mother said, you might like this, you might like this. So I said, okay. I went there one day, I felt isolated, and I was used to being around people who were older than me. So I was either used to being around boys who were older or adults who were older, and I just didn't feel comfortable. So I came home and I said, Mom, please, I don't want to do it anymore. She said, okay, fine. My mom was very good about kind of identifying who we were and allowing us to be ourselves. When desegregation came about, it came about in waves in Arlington County. At one point, there was massive resistance, and from my understanding, all of the counties in Virginia closed their schools, with the exception of Arlington, to avoid having black students attend schools with white students. So in 1971, that was another wave of integration. My father and some other members of the community, the black community, I think it was Luttrell Parker as well, had a lawsuit, and my mother was also on that lawsuit against Arlington County because the black students were actually being bused. We were being bused out of our neighborhoods, and none of the white students were being bused in our neighborhoods. And my parents felt that this was unfair, so they took out this lawsuit. However, in 1971, my mother was appointed to the Arlington County School Board. So she had to recuse herself from that lawsuit because, in essence, she would have been suing herself. So unfortunately, that lawsuit, my father and the other community members lost that lawsuit. So here we were bused off to Tuckahoe. Now, if I remember correctly, what my mom did, one of her greatest accomplishments in her mind was when she was on the school board, she felt that busing all the students at one time was a big mistake. You had high school students who had gone to school together, and then to separate them would cause a lot of animosity. So what she did, because she knew that she really wanted to go through with this, she was chairman at the time, she brought that particular issue to the floor on a day when she knew she had enough votes to pass her way of getting it through. And that was to have elementary school, all the elementary school students would be bused. I don't recall about the junior high, I think they had a choice too. The high school students had a choice to black students had a choice to either remain at their home school or their base school or to be bused. My oldest brother, Charles, who was not considered the coolest kid among the black students, he played cello, which was not considered cool. He was very academically inclined. He was an artist. He decided to go to Yorktown, and that was the best move for him. He was taunted by a lot of black kids when he was at, the black schools because he just wasn't cool enough. My brother Tommy, on the other hand, was very different. He was an athlete, he was academically inclined, but he played a woodwind instrument, so he was considered cool. So he fit in at Wakefield and he stayed there. I, of course, was bused. And I remember my mother, I don't even remember why I was bused. I don't think my mother discussed that with me. I just knew I was switching schools, and that was it. I went to Tuckahoe, loved it. I fit in. It was the first time in my life that I felt that there was commonality, because I listened to everything. I listened to rhythm and blues, I listened to rock music, I listened to jazz, and there were other kids who could relate to that. And that was a wonderful experience for me. However, there were some issues that I dealt with being the black kid who's being academically inclined. And by the way, I became so social there that my grades dipped just a little bit. I was having a little bit too much fun. But I was taunted by a couple of other black kids, basically, who, I got the thing, you think you're a white girl. You talk like a white girl. You're an Oreo. I had friends who were white. And for the first time in my life, this raised the question of identity in my mind. And I said, wow, okay, so what's wrong with me? Why don't I fit in with other black kids? What's going on here? So it created this insecurity, I guess, to some degree. But off to Williamsburg. Went to Williamsburg. Williamsburg, I felt less of that. However, I became more involved in things like singing and, oh my gosh, what else? I track and field. And what else did I do when I was at Williamsburg? Oh, that's right, drama. See, you remember that. I was involved in drama. I had friends. It was a wonderful experience. And then I went to Yorktown, the same situation. I played powder puff football. I sang in madrigals. And just this wonderful community. I had a boyfriend. He went to Wakefield. But when it was time for me to decide on a college, that question, again, popped up in my mind. Okay, I do have black friends, but what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? Why is it that I seem to still have more white friends at school than I do black friends? So I made the decision to go to an all-black college. And I went there, and upon getting there, wow, I realized something. There's nothing wrong with me. I clicked with everybody. There were kids there who loved rock. They loved Chicago. They loved Led Zeppelin. They loved, all the same kinds of music that I loved. And it was a wonderful experience. And I went to Hampton my first year, and then I transferred to Howard. Howard was a wonderful experience, and I think Kenny can probably tell you the same thing. Howard was wonderful because, again, the teachers were vested in us. They understood as black students, you have to be better than the white kids. You have to be better because you will come up upon someone, and that person will see you, and if you have one little slip up, that person might peg you. And so it was wonderful. I learned about history at Howard. I learned about, also I became a little militant, to be honest with you. I remember at that time I said, I will never marry outside of my race. I will marry a black man. I feel good about myself for the first time. I know who I am. I love my history. This is great. Got out of school, started working. And I was involved with all kinds of things, met all kinds of people from different backgrounds. Well, I ended up dating Hispanic men, black men, white men, Middle Eastern men. It didn't matter to me. And guess who I ended up marrying? Yes, a white man. And that was interesting because his parents, his mother had actually grown up around blacks, but again, you had that strict segregation. You didn't really communicate too much. His father had grown up in West Virginia and really had never been around blacks. So this was a very interesting thing, I think, for him. But God bless my mother-in-law. God bless my mother-in-law. The one thing she told my husband was this. She said, when we were dating, she said, very early in our relationship, I don't care if you marry a black woman, white woman, pink woman, purple, polka dots, I will always love my grandchildren. She does. Matter of fact, my daughter is here today, Kayla. We absolutely love her. And the one thing I'll say, I'm going to wrap it up because I know that my time is coming to an end as well. The one thing I did, I think that growing up in Arlington was wonderful because I had diversity. One of my best friends was Jewish, so I learned about Jewish holidays and the Holocaust, and these were things I don't think I would have experienced in other places. And so when I became the parent of biracial children, it prepared me. We talked openly about race. When my daughter was just a little itsy-bitsy thing, I had chocolate ice cream and I had vanilla ice cream. And so I knew she liked them both, had to know that she liked them both. I had her taste the chocolate. I said, "Do you like it?" She said, "Oh, Mommy, that's so good." I said, "That's me." Had her taste the vanilla. "Do you like it?" "Oh, yeah, Mommy, that's good." I said, "That's Daddy." So then I took it and I mixed it up and I had her taste it. I said, "Do you like it?" She said, "Yeah, I love it." I said, "That's you." I said, "You are the beautiful culmination of everything I am and everything your dad is." And so we were able to kind of get through that. I said, some people will try to tell you if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. That's not true, because to ignore any part of you is to ignore your beautiful, rich diversity. And so here I am. Thank you, Arlington.
All right.
Now I'll introduce you. Okay. And the last person who's speaking this evening is Klein Price. And Klein was not raised in Arlington, although he has a lot of family in Arlington because he is the grandson of Charles Drew. But he recently came back to Arlington to raise his family. And you're on. Would you like this or this? Is this easier?
Yeah, maybe one.
Sure. There you go.
Good evening, everyone. First, let me say, this is the first time I've ever spoken publicly, so you'll forgive me. I'm not as organized as everybody else. I'm a little bit more scatterbrained, so bear with me. And if I look like I'm spacing out, I am.
We're a friendly audience.
Just trying to remember where I left off. Just thinking about some things that you had said about wanting to be, having to be better. I just remember something that my grandfather had said, and that was excellence of performance transcends any physical barriers put in place by man. And I think that's the way he kind of lived his life. Let me just briefly tell you a little bit about me. She's right, I didn't grow up in Arlington. I grew up in the suburbs in Columbia, Maryland, which is not too far away from here. I didn't really know that I had very many relatives in Virginia. And when I told my father and my uncle that I was coming to talk about family history in Virginia, they got all fired up. And they started hitting me with all these emails, and so I had tried to sort through all that is here. I don't even know where to begin. I think that this is an opportunity to talk about my family, so I don't want to seem, I'm very proud of my family roots. And so I don't want to seem like I'm putting on airs, but you've asked me to come and talk a little, so I'll just do the best that I can. I'd like to talk a little bit about my granddaddy Drew, Louis Latimer, Nero Hawley, and George Latimer. And lastly, Gunnell's Chapel, which is on, I think it's Georgetown Pike in Langley, right next to CIA. That's Gunnell's Church, going way back. That's a relative of mine as well. So let me just start with who I am. My name is Klein Price. I'm the son of B.B. Drew and Klein Price. My mom, B.B., she was named after my grandfather's work with Blood Bank. My grandfather wasn't there for the delivery. He was working at Columbia University doing his research. And so my grandmother, not knowing what to name this first child, when a nurse had suggested, why not BB for Blood Bank? And so that's where that came from. Let's see. I moved back to Virginia because I met a wonderful woman. Maybe you all have heard of her. She's the principal of Campbell Elementary School, Sandy Lockhead. And that's one of my greatest achievements. is impressing her enough. I'm sorry, impressing her enough to tell me that, yes, she would marry me. And then one of my other, besides my children, they are also wonderful, but the one thing that's really moved me in my life is, raising a family here, but I also have been a volunteer of the Bethesda Chevy Chase Rescue Squad since 1994, and that's one of my, I really enjoy that work. And if you see me speeding around Arlington, then you'll understand where I get some of that from. Let's see. BB and the Drew family, she's the, Charles Drew had BB, Charlene Drew Jarvis, who you might know from the District of Columbia, and Sylvia Drew. She was pretty instrumental in some of the 60s. She worked for in law and was instrumental in the what's this called? The 60s movement, where
Civil rights.
Civil rights movement. Thank you very much. See, I told you, scatterbrained.
Glad to help.
Then there's my dad, whose family comes from Virginia, Gunnell's Church. One of the things I like to tell people sometimes is that not many of my relatives stayed slaves for very long. They either bought their freedom, or, for example, talking about Nero Hawley, he fought in the Revolutionary War, and because he fought so bravely, they gave him his freedom. Let's see, where else am I? When we first sat down to kind of discuss this, and we joined together, I kind of opened up to the group and said, I really didn't know very much about racism. No one ever called me boy or used the N-word. And I think that I grew up quite sheltered. Both my parents, their parents, Dr. Drew and my father's father, taught at Howard University, and so we never really ventured out past that Howard University community. And so growing up, my parents' friends were all faculty brats as well. And so that was the family that I associated with growing up. And I said I grew up in Columbia, Maryland. If we went to a beach, we went to which was considered a black beach on the Chesapeake, called Highland Beach. It wasn't private, but it was where the black folks went from Howard University. I'm sorry if
This thing, I think, is pulling us down.
I'm not speaking loudly enough for people.
There, that's better.
The Paynes, the Hills, and the Prices, those were my friends. I never really ventured outside of that. When my father was a practicing physician in Columbia, Maryland, and when they talked about integration, I guess I was shielded from all that. I just didn't know what any of that meant. Whenever we traveled somewhere, we traveled in our motorhome, and so we didn't have to experience, going to a hotel or having people look at us crossways. I mean, that happened from time to time when you would go to public restaurants, but most people looked at us and trying to figure out what we were. Because I'm not very dark-skinned, and I don't have traditional African-American features. Really, no one in my family does. And so maybe stepping out into public, no one could really label us right away. When I went away to high school, I wouldn't say I really experienced it, but more curiosity. People would say, "Well, you don't look black, you don't talk black." So that may have been my experience with it. But I told these guys, I said, I never really experienced it. But then my mom came to Arlington to give a talk to one of the local high schools. And I just showed up because I figured I was going to get free lunch out of it and just go to lunch with Mom after she gave her talk. And so I was in the audience and I was listening to her. And again, I say this, I preface it by saying I didn't know anything about racism. And I never really experienced it until toward the end of her speech, she was talking about, my grandfather's death. He died in the automobile accident in North Carolina. And she said that maybe he would still be alive today if he had the opportunity to pull over and rest in a hotel. And when she said that, it registered with me because, I don't think twice about, as most people today don't think twice about hopping in a car and drive somewhere, and if you get tired, you pull over and you get a hotel room. And growing up, young guy looking for what to do, and I would have loved to have had him as a mentor, but I never had that opportunity, and that was made real that day when my mom said, he may have made it to his destination had he been given the opportunity to take a rest in a hotel. There's a great book that, another thing that we kind of discussed was because the old rumor was that he died in an automobile accident because he wasn't given a blood transfusion. Well, there's a great book out that kind of describes from the doctor's perspectives, the surviving doctors who were in the car, that he actually was, he was recognized and he was treated well, and they did try and transfuse him. But coming from emergency medicine, in my training, there's something called the golden hour. And reading the details of some of his injuries, by the way, the name of the book is One Blood.
One blood.
And it details the injuries. And coming from a medic perspective, he'd have never made it. Even if they had an ambulance or if they had a helicopter flying and medevaced him out, his injuries were just too severe. And no amount of transfusion was going to help him. It was just, his number was up and that was it. I'd mentioned...
4 minutes.
All right. Sorry. I told you, scatterbrained. So I mentioned... I'll just close with Lewis Latimer. That's a relative of mine. He worked for Edison. But even though Edison invented the light bulb, I'd like to think that Lewis Latimer was the one who made it work. Right? You can find and Thomas Edison in an exhibit at the Museum of American History, and there's a little plaque inside that said Lewis Latimer, and it kind of explains his patent on the light bulb. And so, there's one for the black folks. George Latimer, this is one thing that I got from my dad and my uncle, because I told you they were all fired up about me coming in here to talk, and I'll just end with this. George Latimer was a slave, and he is the father of Lewis Latimer. George was a slave of a guy by the name of James B. Gray of Virginia. And we have at my parents' house on the wall the advertisement that Mr. James had put in a local paper saying that he had two escaped slaves, or one escaped slave, and it's believed that he took off with his girlfriend who was missing from another person. So that's hanging on the wall in our house, and I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, so George Latimer, back to Virginia, escaped slave. Anyway, I think that's it.
Is that it? Thank you very much. There's a question or comment here? Please.
I have a comment. All of you use the word sheltered or cocooned. All of you. Yeah, I mean, you've all said that.
Thank you.
They're younger than I am, but we would not have survived if we had not been cocooned, really. And I had a fun childhood, but it was all in Washington. I took piano lessons there, dance lessons, and the museums, like the streetcars, were always available to everybody. And I lived in the museums, and but outside of that environment, we had to be cocooned. We would not have survived.
There's another question or comment here, right here, and then one in the back. Yes.
Hey, Maddie, I think you were saying something about Glen Echo and some girls protesting there. Was that in '61 or was that an earlier?
That was
I mean,
earlier.
in '60.
That was earlier.
Before '60. Okay.
I may have read about it later in the 60s, but I learned about it when we were going to this other park, and I never knew why I just took it for granted. We had fun at that park. But in later years, when I read this paper about the girls protesting, that's when I knew and reflected back, oh, gee, that's why we always went to Suburban Park.
I knew there had been major demonstrations there in '60.
That's when I learned why, I guess.
Thank you. In the back. Thank you very much, Dulce. Thank you.
Actually carries. It's very wonderful to hear how sheltered you were, because from my perspective, when I came to Washington, to Arlington, in 1953 from Chicago, I was horrified at the segregation and at the measures that were taken to keep blacks from voting, the poll tax, the blank paper registration law, all the attempts by the Bird machine to keep blacks from having a voice. And the date that I remember that you were born after was January 9, 1956, when, I don't know if he's connected to the Gray that you mentioned, but there was a bill, the Gray Commission, there was a referendum, statewide referendum, on whether, in order to avoid the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, whether Virginia should adopt a pattern, a program of vouchers. That's why for some people the word vouchers is still a no-no. And that was put to a referendum, and by a vote of 350,000 to 140,000, the voucher plan was adopted. It was a clear attempt and an expensive attempt and a divisive attempt to keep the schools from being desegregated. It was a very painful period for everyone concerned. You were spared because you were younger and those battles were fought, but I think that it was very difficult to watch.
You know, I wanted to just elaborate a little bit about, we all talked about, you know, maybe I'll just use the word loved, blanketed in the community. You know, just as a parent, you know, there's pain and suffering that you don't want your child to experience. And so I think through, you know, through having strong family, through having, you know, going to Annapolis which was the Black Beach, Highland Beach there, you know, and going to the industrial bank and getting an ice cream cone, you know, you're not thinking about the reason why you're going there, and so on. It's just you know, black families and black people have always survived and learned how to get along and make do with what you had. You know, I'm in the food service business, and I used to tell stories about how, you know, my ancestors ate pig's guts, you know, and that was because that was slopping the hog, and that's what was thrown away. And so, you know, those are horrible things, and you know that you know, so I think, you know, we look at the way folks had to survive. So, and I just look at it as a lot of love, and, you know, things that were developed to overcome things. And Patty, I'm gonna let you add to that.
Make it quick. My mother grew up in a town, my mother and father grew up in a little small town, and it was very interesting because when I went there, there was that strong line of segregation. It was funny because it was like white people didn't exist, honestly, until I went downtown. But let me tell you, this was a little town, and all of the people that I can think about who came from this little town, again, it's that community love, people working together, understanding, blacks working together, understanding that you have to be better than the next. Every person I can think of who came from that little community went on to do great things. Advanced education, my godfather was a Tuskegee Airman. As a matter of fact, his name was Henry Wise. He was, I think, the first black on staff at Prince George's Prince George's Hospital. So I look at, yeah, I didn't know you knew. So you see, I mean, just here that our community is small. It's very small. And so when you have, even though you had segregation at that point, everyone knew how hard it was. So everyone was vested. You know, your neighbor was vested in your child. And so you worked together. And so that's what my mother loved Cape Charles, but it was very segregated. And I look at the things that all of them accomplished, and it's absolutely amazing. And I think we were talking about this earlier. We were saying that, you know, it's wonderful to have integration. One of the things we're missing, though, in doing that is the community. You know, if you have the integration where you have that equality, but you also have that strong community base, you can't go wrong. But I think we're missing that now, and I think that's across the board. A lot of races, doesn't matter if it's just blacks, whites, or whatever, we're missing that.
Very,
Yeah,
very
like to
briefly,
add-
Vivian.
I would just like to add something,
Yeah.
and that is this is March is Women's History Month, and I think it would be remiss not to mention a woman who was a beacon of courage in the period of desegregation, and that was Catherine Stone, who was in the House of Delegates, and she was
In Virginia.
in Virginia from Arlington. No, Arlington was very much ahead of the rest of the state in moving toward desegregation. We really did not resist it. It was something that we welcomed. But Catherine Stone in the House of Delegates, the first woman elected in 20 years and the first woman from Northern Virginia, Catherine Stone stood on the floor of the House and begged the legislature not to have the great referendum, and she was vilified, and members of the legislature would get off the elevator in Richmond, in the state capitol, when they saw Catherine Stone. She served from 1954 to 1966, and she was a heroic figure, and I would like to just mention her to you because many of you probably do not know her.
Thank you, Vivian. Are there other questions? Yes, there's one here.
My question is really to fast forward and reminded too that we do think of ourselves here in Arlington as very progressive, but I'm very much aware that there are some of the same problems in coming back into society, and most of all I'm struck by a book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which really lays out how the rate at which people of color are incarcerated is in effect creating a permanent underclass. So I have to ask myself as an Arlingtonian, how is it in our county? How much more likely is a person of color to be stopped by the police, to be searched, to have their rights abused as a citizen, and how aware are we?
Thank you for the question. Is anyone interested in responding? You don't feel as if you have to.
I'll try my best to handle it. I think that growing up as a young man in Arlington, and certainly now, I have a 23-year-old son that lives here in Arlington, Kenny James Jr., and I constantly remind him that as a young black man, you got to have your stuff together. That means, there are stereotypes that you're going to be looked at. He has chosen to wear his hair with dreadlocks. And, unfortunately, that's something that people are going to, you might get stereotyped by those things. But as a young black male, I tell him, your education is first. That you have to, put yourself in the right company. All of us, we know people that haven't done the right thing and so on, and you've got to make those choices. You can't get caught up in peer pressure. You've got to do the right things, and that is to follow through, and don't get caught off. Don't allow yourself to get caught up in negative things. Think positive and move forward. So that's what I would try to encourage young men to do, and to you have to, you got to have self-respect for yourself and other people around you, and I'll just put it out here. I know this is predominantly white crowd, but I work in the whenever I see a young man with his pants pulling down, I think we need to have a law: pull your damn pants up. It is the worst thing in the world, and I pray that one day we have some type of law, because to me it's like, I work in food service. You don't want somebody showing their underwear, and you're getting ready to sit down and eat and so on. So self-respect for yourself, for other people around you. Do the right things. That would help. I think and trying to be the best, get your education, and knowing that there's opportunities out here for you to be successful in life. We have to keep on those paths, and I think that would help our young people stay from being incarcerated.
Can I make one little?
Yes, of course.
I don't know the rate at which.
I don't know this.
I
no.
don't know the rate at which black men are incarcerated, but
In Arlington.
In Arlington, but I hope if they meet a policeman, it'll be like the one I met a few weeks ago. I made a U-turn where I wasn't supposed to, and he came behind me and he said, "I noticed that you're from out of town." So be careful next time. I thought, me out of town, but I got by with it, so fine. So I hope.
I'll say a quick comment. With my children, racism is still here. That's the bottom line. And so when I talk to my kids, I say, again, you bear the brunt of so many years that have come before you. In other words, there's always going to be someone out there who's waiting to point to you and say, see how, if she's acting up, if my daughter's acting up, see, that's how black people act. So, it's just the fact of it. I think a lot of us, when we raise our children, black parents, that's what we tell them. I get concerned about my son because interracial dating, that could still be a problem, and if he finds himself in a circumstance, you just never know. And so with my children, I'm always telling them, you have to be very, very careful. You always have to be the best. Again, you are the role model. People look at you wherever you go, and not just because you're mixed, biracial, or whatever, but you should do the right thing, and you should always live your life in a way that you can be proud and that you don't have to look back. But understand that there are people out there who are willing to make you the scapegoat. So, we're just very frank about it.
Thank you very much, and I'd like you to give a hand to these folks. All of you. Patty and Kenny and Maddie and Klein. Good. Thank you for coming.
This was spectacular. You know what I have a friend who's from Hawaii.
Yes.
She's Hawaiian.
Yes.
And what they call this is not telling your story, it's called talking your story.
I know. Talk stories.
Talk story.
Talk stories in Hawaii.
Marty, this was